at whatever level they're at, to constantly have that in the back of their mind. Is my business serving me in my life, or am I giving my life to this business?
Hello, Profit First entrepreneurs and thought leaders. I am so excited today. I am bringing in one of my special guests, one of my colleagues from the trust. And, I have a lot of deep respect for Annie. Annie Wright, who is our guest today, she's actually a licensed psychotherapist, and she specializes specifically in relational trauma. And she works with ambitious, upwardly mobile women who come from backgrounds of trauma. And she runs a agency called the Evergreen Counseling Agency, which is a boutique that specializes in trauma-informed therapy in Berkeley, California. She practices therapy where she oversees over 20 trauma therapists who collectively serve about 450 clients a week. So they've got a lot of experience in this. And in addition to this, Annie also runs an online course called Hard Families, Good Boundaries, which is a transformative video-based program that really helps folks deal with effectively dealing with difficult family members that may be in their lives. Annie is a published author, and her opinions have been published in Business Insider, Forbes, NBC, The Huffington Post, BuzzFeed, and more. And I'm excited about this conversation today is because we're going to talk about how to not recreate your own trauma history in your business. And I think every one of us probably brings our own trauma, right? Whether we see it as a major event or just micro events that have happened over time. And unfortunately, trauma changes us. So I'm excited today to bring Annie Wright to our platform where we're going to talk about not recreating this trauma in your business. So please welcome Annie Wright to our platform. Hey, Annie, how are you doing today?
Oh, Susanne, I'm so happy to be here with you. I'm doing great. And honestly, I'm so excited to have this conversation. I could talk about it all day long.
Well, I'm excited about this conversation. And, I think that a lot of us unknowingly, I've been lucky and fortunate enough to be able to build two businesses now. And, can say that, at some point you look in the mirror and go, oh my gosh, did I just build the same thing again?
Yeah.
I definitely think that at some point trauma has something to do with the things that we create, especially if we come to a point that we're seeing the same thing again twice. And so, Annie, first of all, I love to know the background. Tell me a little bit about, how this became such a passionate impact to you or cause for you, and where are you seeing trauma show up in the workforce?
Oh my goodness. Absolutely. I'm so excited for this conversation. So, by way of introduction, I'm sort of the classic example of what's professional is personal. I myself came from a pretty egregious childhood trauma, relational trauma background, but didn't know to call it that at the time. And it was only really in my mid 20s when it finally caught up with me that I learned what it was and started to put myself back together again and heal from it. And in the course of doing so, I realized, hey, this is kind of what I want to do with my life. This is what I want to do with my profession. So I've dedicated my career to becoming a trauma therapist and serving folks through one-on-one clinical work, creating a trauma-informed boutique therapy center to serve clients that way, through online writing, through my online courses. Every bit of my work in the world is designed to support people who come from adverse early childhood experiences to have wonderful adulthoods. So that's who I am. I'm a trauma clinician by training. I'm sort of an accidental entrepreneur. And what I mean by that is when I started out building my therapy center, and I launched it, in February 2019 when my daughter was 3 months old, and it and her just turned 5. And in that time, it scaled to a $3.3 million business. I became an entrepreneur very quickly and very accidentally, building a big, small business, as it were. And in the course of doing so, I realized not only how incredibly hard it was, but how our businesses can be a mirror, a very intense mirror for all of our unresolved personal stuff. And I think you hit the nail on the head earlier, Susanne, when you said, hey, I've built two businesses, and at a certain point, I realized I've recreated the same thing. And I wanted to jump in and just like double click on that and say, yes, exactly. Because our businesses Well, how shall I say? The way in through one thing is the way into many things. And how you eat, how you vacation, how you, I don't know, manage your finances, and certainly how you manage your business, they're all portals into your early patterning, right? To your maladaptive, meaning dysfunctional behaviors and beliefs, or your adaptive, meaning functional behaviors and beliefs. The thing is, most of us only vacation about 2, maybe 4 weeks out of the year if we're lucky. We do our businesses every day, day in, day out. Sometimes, 8 hours if we're lucky, more like 10 or 12 hours a day, especially in those early days, right? So there's a lot of opportunity there to see our patterning reflected back to us. So again, you're asking that question, like, how did I come to this particular content area, the intersection between serving upwardly mobile, ambitious women and the intersection of unresolved relational trauma? Well, heck, by my own personal story and my own professional endeavors. I've seen so many extraordinary women, founders, co-founders, CEOs, build very big businesses on what feels like quicksand foundations because of their unresolved personal material. So I love working with individuals to come back in, fix the cracks in their proverbial foundations psychologically so that they can either repair what's wrong in their businesses and or build a different business that has a sounder, more stable foundation. So that's a little bit more of who I am and why I do this work in the world.
I love it. And it's very important work. And oh my gosh, what fast growth. I mean, and what
Oh,
a great time to come into it too. I mean, like what you were like the rolling thunder of COVID, right? Where
oh
everybody, I
my
think, had some type of
gosh.
trauma. So what a
Whew.
great time to start a business, particularly with therapy. And, I think that there was a shortage of therapists too, during that time. So
Well, yeah, it was one of those again. I know this now in hindsight. I had this weird sense, gosh, something's coming, something's coming. And, I don't know why I took a leap of faith, with a 3-month-old, but I did. And, the reality is like I was able to create a vehicle that was able to serve a lot of people in that time. So, I would never have wished COVID on anyone. And what was also true is it did sort of accelerate my business's growth. But, again, there are also problems and a particular kind of strain and stress that can come from scaling so darn quickly, particularly when it's your first business and you're not really trained as an entrepreneur and you don't have an MBA, right? So I think we were talking before you hit record too. Not only can we bring our unresolved relational trauma histories into our businesses, but at a certain point, our businesses can traumatize us as well, regardless of whether or not we arrive with a trauma history into it, right? So I think it's important that we just name that doing business is really, really hard, regardless of the background you come from. And we have this frank conversation about how hard it can actually feel and why and how it can feel particularly hard.
and I think that's such an important point too, Annie, because, at least like, I've been fortunate. I've been in business. I actually started my business when I had my little girl too.
Oh,
Probably about when she was 3 months old, but that was like almost 17 years ago.
wow.
And, so a lot of women, we have great careers and we don't want to just stop our careers because of becoming a mother, right?
Yes.
And, and it's so, that's a very important, I think it's a time that a lot of women embrace that, but a message that wasn't brought out and talked about was how difficult it was, or would be starting that embarkment on business, because as an entrepreneur, you have to be well-rounded. You
Mm,
have to be able to, you're kind of like that pigeon between the customer and the team that service the customer, right? And you have to make everybody happy at the end of the day. And it's
oh,
and no matter where you come from in the corporate world, right? There's never a place that you're that intense of being in that center folk or center point.
oh
So
yeah. Yeah.
um, and
Yeah.
so if you guys are experiencing any hard times out there in your businesses, please know you're not alone. That is
Oh yeah.
normal, right? That
Oh
is
yeah.
absolutely normal. And that's why we have folks like Annie here to
Oh,
to talk about giving you some tools to be able to deal with this trauma. So before we go into it, the tools and things like that, Annie, let's define trauma, because some
mhm,
people are like, I had a pretty happy
mhm.
childhood. I was given everything I wanted for the most part. Everybody had something that happened.
Sure.
Um, how do we actually define trauma? And the fact that you even said that our companies can give us trauma. What exactly is
Yeah.
trauma?
Yeah. Oh, this is one of my favorite soapboxes to get on. So like, pardon me while I get on my soapbox. So previously, really roundabout, right up until I would say the early aughts, the clinical community as well as lay people tended to see trauma as a discrete set of experiences, right? Like wartime PTSD or a rape or car crash. And certainly all of these things have the potential to be extremely traumatic. Do not get me wrong about that. But when we relegated trauma to just a discrete set of experiences, a lot of people did not see themselves adequately in that definition and failed to get themselves the right kind of support. So in the third wave of traumatology, which is the study of trauma, which is, my clinical wheelhouse, we have come to understand that trauma is not necessarily a discrete set of experiences, but rather it is any experience or experiences that subjectively overwhelms your brain and body's ability to cope. So I'll say that again. It is any experience or experiences that subjectively overwhelms your brain and body's ability to cope. In that more broad, nuanced definition, that means that what may make something traumatic to me may not to you, and that depends on a whole host of factors. Our internal resources, the external resources that existed to maybe help us metabolize the experience and move through it, make sense of it, digest it in our nervous systems, etc. But if, let's say, I did not have the same external supports that you did, if I had underdeveloped internal resources, something might happen to me, an experience or set of experiences that to you would have been like a little blip, but to me could have completely felt like an annihilation terror, or could have felt like life or death. And it might have overwhelmed my brain and body's ability to cope. And so for me, that would have landed as a trauma, right? Whereas it may not for you. So you can see that with this new definition we have around the subjectivity of trauma, it's not just a discrete set of checkbox experiences, but rather we can begin to see our lives and the things that happen in our lives with a little bit more nuance, to being able to see, oh my gosh, that chronic middle school bullying I endured, that was a trauma, right? That was a trauma. It didn't look like wartime PTSD, but boy, that did overwhelm me, right? Now, all this to say, Susanne, there are still sort of 4 buckets of experiences that we tend to classify trauma into. Acute, that's those single incident traumas like car crashes, really terrifying plane flights, or, like bombings, school shootings, things like that, very unfortunately. Then there's chronic trauma, right? Like ongoing medical illnesses and medical traumas, chronic bullying, growing up in a very food insecure or housing insecure household, a community with violence. Then we have complex trauma, also called developmental trauma, the kind that exists between usually a caregiver, a guardian, and a child, that leads to the child feeling like their dignity or their safety is impaired. And then finally, we have secondary or vicarious trauma. So that's a very wide range of what trauma can look like. And again, with this broader, wide lens happening in these 4 buckets, hopefully more people on this call will see themselves and their experiences more clearly.
Definitely. And it also gives you that freedom to start to search for, why do these things keep happening to me, right?
Correct.
And maybe you were not involved with a war or something that was on the Channel 11 news, right? But there could be other things that have built up to that point. So, giving yourself, it gives you that permission to give yourself that grace, that yes. And I think anybody that's lived through COVID, right?
Mhm.
Anybody above the age of probably 1 has had some type of trauma from that too.
Oh, definitely, definitely. And again, the way that each of us metabolize that experience could look, potentially very different, but there's a whole chunk of this planet that did experience that as a trauma, that's for sure. Now, I'd love to talk about, too, what happens with trauma and why and how this is so salient to us as entrepreneurs, and then why we may see this reflected back to us in our businesses. So when we have the adequate internal and external supports, we can digest and metabolize a traumatic experience in our nervous system, in our brain and our body, so that it doesn't lodge in our brain in a maladaptively stored place, but rather goes into long-term storage where it belongs, and we free our nervous system up and we can kind of move through it and just appropriately metabolize it. But again, if we don't have those internal and external supports available, that experience may lodge in a part of our brain where it doesn't belong. And us being human, the humans that we are, we start to scaffold a wide range of maladaptive cognitions, meaning beliefs or behaviors around it to sort of accommodate for it, right? So an example of this might be a little girl growing up with a highly alcoholic, potentially a sociopathic father may come to believe no man is safe and I can't trust anyone, right? And really, those are appropriate beliefs that kept her safe when she was little. Maybe she keeps her distance from this person. She learns to leave the room when he's around. But she arrives into adulthood with these same beliefs, and perhaps they're maladaptive now. They're not serving her. They're keeping her out of relationship and coming into conflict with her desire to want to be in partnership, to be in relationship. Maybe even in her business, she finds herself constantly at odds with a male coworker, unable to task him with responsibility. It's starting to create a bottleneck in her business, something like that, right? So that's where our businesses start to reflect back. Hey, where are these maladaptive beliefs that we formed getting in our way now? And what else is possible if we begin to work on them and to work on those very early painful memories that led to them in the first place? Because this isn't just about thought work. Thought work I always like to think about is it's kind of like decorating your dream house with pretty paintings and like the right curtains and all of that. No, no, no. That thought work is lovely and that's fine. What we are talking about is foundational basement level work when it comes to trauma therapy. We are going back down to the basement, repairing the cracks in the foundation, taking care of the septic system. It's nothing glamorous or sexy, but we are rewiring the neural pathways of the brain. We are forming more adaptive cognitions. We're helping your body metabolize the trauma. And that is what starts to build a firmer foundation for your beautiful house, right? The house of life.
I love that. I love that. And that's interesting too, because I mean, I'm sure like, you know, you guys will probably resonate with me at some point, but sometimes there's like you don't even know the person's how they speak, that tone, right? It just sends your skin up in curls, right? And it's the person never did anything to you. It's just almost like some memory. And that could be trauma. That could be something that you face, right? And if one of your team members or someone shows up for an interview and they have that voice for whatever reason.
Oh, yes. We have this saying in therapy, what's hysterical is historical. So when you find yourself having a response to something happening in your present that doesn't match what's happening in your present, boy, that's a big clue the past is present, right? Right? Because maybe if all your team members are, having a pretty neutral response to this person, but you are flooded with rage or you are flooded with fear, right? Big clue that the past is present, right? And, it's the wonderful and terrible thing about being an entrepreneur, because we are going to be presented with our material all the time, right? Whenever especially once you start to scale and you hire people and there's people management involved, hard conversations, boundaries, taking leadership, saying no to salary increases, right? Anytime there are people and people issues, we have to remember most trauma typically happens in the context of relationship, and it's through relationship that it's going to be illuminated. So the wonderful and terrible thing about building big businesses is that our stuff is going to be mirrored back to us a lot. It's both really painful and really uncomfortable, but boy, is it wonderful grist for the mill for our personal growth work. It's a wonderful opportunity for growth if we pay attention and take it to our therapist.
I love it. And I think even like what you said earlier, Annie, is, you talk about hyper growth. You started a business as a new mom and overnight um, grew it to almost a $3 million business, right? Or over 3
Precisely.
million.
Mhm.
And so you talked about in the hypergrowth. I know a lot of times when I talk to entrepreneurs, they have this dollar amount set in their mind
Mhm.
of this is what it's going to look like when I get there. Things are going to get easier when I get there. And the reality is, guys, more money, more problems.
Oh my
Okay. That just means more people, just like Annie says, that you're going to have
God.
to deal with. Right.
Mhm. Mhm.
And you have to have more people. And unfortunately, they don't all come in carbon copies. You can't push a button and a person's manufactured exactly how you want. And as Annie said, that's going to be triggering. So Annie, let's talk about some of the
Sure.
things that you see in hyper growth businesses that trigger that trauma, create that trauma, or what do you see that? Because I know a lot of our entrepreneurs, they're implementing profit first.
Mhm.
They're growing rapidly. They're figuring out what is that component of reinvestment to get to that growth level.
Hmm.
Um, what are some of the things that our entrepreneurs are going to be facing if they're going to be looking for hyper growth?
Oh my goodness gracious. Well, I'm not sure I would wish hypergrowth on anyone, to be honest, having experienced it myself. I was chuckling a little bit earlier because I was asked in an interview once, somebody asked me, they were like, well, what were the skills that you had to learn in terms of building your business and building it so quickly? I was like, all of the skills. I had to learn all of the skills. And that happened in tandem with new motherhood too, where I had to learn all of the skills, right, alongside biological deprivation. So I'm saying this because I think one of the number one issues an entrepreneur faces when they're building a business, whether it's rapid or slow, is a feeling of perpetual incompetence and feeling behind and feeling scared. So that perpetual incompetence comes from the fact that we are having to learn all the skills. Like, I do not have an MBA. I have a master's in counseling psychology and really good business instincts. But I do not how to, I didn't know how to do, financial forecasting. I didn't even know how to create a darn budget and do profit first. I did not know how to create a rock solid employee handbook or register my company in different states and be compliant with labor law. Like, I had to learn all the skills. And in that space of incompetence, because of my own personal history, I have a history of there was poverty at times, and there were certainly life and death situations. So all of my old material around, fears that it would all collapse, I would be left on the street, or I'd end up in jail, or something catastrophic would happen. Again, not tied to any bit of reality, but in that space of incompetence, all of my old stuff around catastrophic thinking showed up, right? What if I'm not smart enough? What if I'm not doing this well enough? What if I'm not doing it fast enough? This thing is growing faster than I can be competent in. What if I make a mistake? Is the FBI going to come up and handcuff me? Again, not rooted in reality, like nothing rooted in reality. But again, when you come from a trauma history, and there were moments of life and death, or again, financial insecurity, food insecurity, etc., that space of incompetence and having to take on larger amounts of responsibility can trigger a lot of fear responses for many of us. So that's one of the number one things I see for entrepreneurs at all levels, like whether they're at 100,000 or at 1 million or at 5 million, we're all living with usually a very large degree of fear if we're not necessarily putting sound business principles and practices into place and doing our personal work.
Oh yeah, and Annie, it's interesting too that you said that because as an entrepreneur, and I'm sure many of our audience are that a lot of times we are what I call the Gen 1 entrepreneurs. There isn't somebody in
Yeah,
our family that gave us a business and said run with it. We're
totally.
not the Rockefellers, right?
Totally.
Where we had generations of wealth. And a lot of times, especially, in people of color, right?
Yeah.
Which is some of our audience, there's been challenges of, you know, the world judges us differently, or at least
Correct.
inwardly, we feel that. And so
Correct.
there's a constant need to prove yourself too.
Correct.
And
Correct.
so at times, I can understand that feeling of, am I building this on a house of cards? When is it going to all collapse?
Absolutely.
And this good thing that's here, and I've heard other entrepreneurs talk about it too, is,
Hmm.
how long is this good thing going to last? And reality is it usually lasts a lot longer until you send it away, right? It's
Right.
usually how long it lasts. But
Oh my
that
gosh.
that
Yeah.
that fear is always there.
Totally. And I want to name for anyone who's not actually watching the video, like I am a white woman, right? So I am not a woman of color, but I am the first in my family to go to college, the first to break the poverty cycle, and I'm the sole breadwinner in my family. And I think, Suzanne, we probably talked about this at one of our trust meetings where, I shared that with you, how I identify as first gen. So there's no safety net beneath me, right? And so that adds a layer of fear. But what I don't have to live with is the racial trauma, the constant racial microaggressions, and that traumatic experience of having social structures that are working against me that women of color do. So combine that with being first gen, with the inherent fear and scariness of being an entrepreneur on a roller coaster. My God, that's a lot, right? Like that is a lot. And so, again, regardless of whether or not we identify as coming from a personal trauma history, we do need to be mindful that there are sort of social traumas that some members of our population have endured, right? And entrepreneurship in and of itself is a scary, strainful ride, right? So if you're not having a hard time as an entrepreneur, I mean, definitely send me an email. I would love to know at least one person because I've never met one, right? And I say this kind of joking, but also to normalize this experience. I think so many of us are like, am I the only one who is waking up with fear every single day, feeling like this is Kilimanjaro and I have to climb it yet again, and I don't want to climb it, but I have no choice, right? I think so many of us feel that way, but we're not really talking about it that much.
Yeah, and it's across demographics, it's across sexes, even folks that you think would have it all together, or second gen, that yeah, met with, it's something that is throughout businesses really with it. It's an entrepreneur thing is really what it is. And I'm curious now, Annie, we're having this great conversation and let's talk about tools. Let's talk about
Sure.
tools that we can leave our audience with to
Mm.
help them deal with the trauma. Because we know that it's out there. We know everybody's had it, whether it's that third grade bully or something that has been passed down to you, or unfortunately you've been a victim of a situation. What are some tools that we can use to deal with trauma? Like where do we begin?
Well, so my answer to this relies on the principle of what can help us metabolize trauma at any age inherently, which is like adequate internal supports and adequate external supports. So, as an entrepreneur, if you're listening and you're identifying with this and thinking, oh my God, yes, my personal trauma is showing up, or actually my business is re traumatizing me, here's what I would want to say. With regards to building the appropriate level of internal supports, I know this is going to be a contentious issue, and I would say please choose yourself a therapist in that situation, a licensed mental health professional, ideally trained as a trauma trained professional, which means that they have advanced training in one of the evidence based trauma treatment modalities that we have. The reason why I recommend that, apart from a coach, and I do love coaches, I love them so much. I do want to be mindful that they are sometimes a little bit more focused on putting the furniture and decorating the walls of the first and second floor versus that basement level work that a trauma therapist will be able to do with you. And if you feel like your foundation might actually have those cracks, that is the first recommendation I typically make in terms of building the adequate level of internal supports. Okay. So from there, you work with your therapist to decide what other internal supports are needed, adequate time in the schedule, journaling, etc. Maybe getting the biopsychosocial basics in place, adequate diet, adequate exercise, maybe even medication if you need to outsource your serotonin. Okay, so those are the internal supports. External, I feel very passionate. That's where I do want you to rely on whether we call them coaches or consultants or strategists or mentors, I'm not sure, but basically business professionals who can teach you sound business principles to alleviate the strain and the stress that you feel with regards to very cumbersome big problems. So what do I mean by this? I pay my attorneys a lot of money. I pay my attorneys a lot of money as my external supports, and that helps me metabolize my trauma and not feel traumatized by my business because I know I have a team of external people who are helping me solve problems. I have an amazing CPA. I also pay for trainings that help me do things like create financial forecasts and employee compensation and benefits plans, right? I believe heavily in paying other professionals to help you learn and fill in the gaps of your own education so that you have adequate external supports, right? Grounded in sound business principles, and you're working with a trained professional to rewire some of these maladaptive beliefs and behaviors, right, at the basement level. Those are the two things I've found coming from my own trauma history and being an entrepreneur who experienced rapid growth that have really helped me. So I hope that feels helpful to hear.
It is. And so really what I'm hearing then, it's a combination of two things. One is doing the internal work, right? So when
Correct.
you hear that guy's voice and your skin is curling, right? We got to get to the bottom of why is our skin curling, right? And deal with that. Or if you're feeling overwhelmed with your schedule, being able to have that third party voice going, okay, maybe we got to humanize this situation a little bit more and create breathing room in that schedule. And then the second part is really about creating protecting yourself, really. Like you said, one of the things that's important with attorneys is before you get married, before you get into a contract, whether it's a partner or a customer or an employee, right? You want to know the ground rules. You want to know what we're agreeing to before we even began. And so having that professional that allows you to establish those parameters that protect you and protect that customer, protect that employee in the long run, it's just a win-win for all, right? And
Totally.
especially if you're in a hyper growth situation, you're not going to know all that, and you should not know all that. There's a degree, there's a license, there's a test, right?
Mhm.
To become an attorney, and so we want those people to have that, and so getting that right level of help for where you're at on the business side as well as on the psychology side is important.
Yeah, I mean, I also want to suggest that when we pay people who are experts in their area to support us, it's a little bit like reparenting, right? We're reparenting ourselves. We're receiving reparenting. We're getting good, adequate support from authority figures. So believe me, there is a hefty line item in my personal and my professional budget for paying for professional supports. It's one of my favorite things to do, to be honest.
That's awesome. Yeah, I mean, definitely, it lays the groundwork for everything. Those contracts, how you'll deal with, how you'll resolve issues when they do come
Sure.
up, and it's very important because, knock on wood, there are very few things that ever come up, but in the event that it did, being able to sleep at night is very important with that.
I love that you said that. And I have never met an entrepreneur, particularly at this level, who doesn't have scary things happen at least quarterly, like whether it's letters from the IRS or like EDD stuff. So, and again, and that's another piece of this, just normalizing it for anyone out there who's like, wait, knock on wood. I mean, I have scary things happen every week. It's like, yeah, that is also part of the ride, right? And I don't think that entrepreneurship necessarily gets easier. Again, like new level, new devil. Like it is hard at every single level. But what we do, right, through a combination of our internal work and lining up appropriate external supports, is we build capacity to endure the hard. So whereas like maybe in year one, if we got a letter from the IRS, we would have lost our minds with fear. Year three, we're like, okay, I'm passing this on to my CPA before I freak out, right? So that is also part of the journey, right? Like normalizing that it remains hard. Like there are always going to be hard things, but you build capacity and you learn how to endure it better, hopefully.
Yeah, and then you just keep building capacity. That's a great way to look at that too, is it just grows you. Everything that you do, it just grows you.
Correct.
Um, Now, Annie, one of the things that I love to ask our guests is if you could leave our audience with one piece of advice. It can be personal, it can be business. What would that piece of advice be?
Here's what I really, really feel passionate about saying, particularly to fellow entrepreneurs, because it's not a conversation that I'm hearing very often in this space. And again, Suzanne, we were talking about this before you hit record. What I don't think we talk often enough about in entrepreneurship circles is leaving your business and walking away from your business or closing it down can also be a success too. And that is a valid option. And sometimes that is the best possible option to save your own mental health. I'm not saying that because I'm intending to close down my own business or walk away from it. I'm saying it because as a therapist who has worked with many, many co-founders, many CEOs, many startup founders, etc., I've seen people compromise the relationships with their children, their spouses, their own mental health to the point of suicidal ideations, major depression, etc., all because they were tied to the idea of making it, right? Finally IPOing or finally getting bought out. And at a certain point, all of us have to ask ourselves the question, is the quality of our life worth the potential payout, right? And so that is the piece I would leave for your audience, right? At whatever level they're at, to constantly have that in the back of their mind. Is my business serving me in my life, or am I giving my life to this business, right? And be mindful about that and have that actively as a conversation point with your therapist. So that's the one piece of advice I would leave because I don't hear enough people talking about that.
I love it. I love it. And and a business is, an asset, at the end of the day, right? And, I love Kenny Rogers' song, every hand's a good hand, every hand, the gambler, every hand's a bad hand, right? It's about when. And your business should not define you, right? At the end of the day, it should be a benefit to you. And to me, no business should be held on forever. So
I can't help but agree. And I think, and again, we need to know what is the target we're shooting the arrow at. And hopefully the target is always our life and not the business. Do you know what I mean?
definitely, definitely, definitely. Business should support life, not the other way around, right?
Exactly.
Um, Now, Annie, in terms of like being able to contact you, in terms of being able to learn more,
Yeah.
to learn about hard families, good boundaries, what's the best way for our audience to reach out to you to connect with you?
Sure, sure. So you can find kind of everything about me on my website, anniewright.com. You can learn more about my story. You can learn about my signature course. I do have this really cool little quiz where if you're like not even sure if you come from a childhood trauma background, take this quiz. I've written it in a really beautifully illustrative way that can help you see you and your story a little bit more clearly and then link you to information to help you get started on, kind of repairing the cracks in your foundation right away. In addition to that, I have been writing high quality mental health essays every 2 weeks since the spring of 2015. So there's over 200 high quality long form essays on my blog on that website. So you'll find everything you might possibly want to know about recovering from childhood trauma or relational trauma. So that's the number one way to find me. And, certainly if folks listening live in California, or Florida, actually, because my therapy center serves both states. We'd be delighted to work with you as your personal therapist if you yourself resonate as, oh my goodness, a business owner who could use a therapist to actually work me through this stuff. You can certainly find us at evergreencounseling.com as well. Maybe I'll be your therapist. I'd certainly be delighted to support anyone in this audience.
Thank you, Annie. This was definitely wonderful information. I'm going to go ahead and put Annie's contact information in the show notes so that you guys, when you get to a safe place, right, you can pull over and connect with her and learn more about really dealing with trauma so that you can really propel your business in a way that you're proud of. So thank you, Annie, for joining us today and sharing your wealth of information.
Oh my gosh, it is an honor. It is a privilege. And I hope that what I shared can be helpful to even one listener of your audience.